We've known for a long time that saturated fat raises our cholesterol levels, but that's just a marker. What we really want to know is, do people get actual heart disease? Classical studies linked saturated fat and heart disease.
Guild tells us that this study wasn't good, but to use that as an argument to dismiss high-fat study that tells us that high fat is not the problem.
Also important, they found no harmful effects of reducing saturated fat, which is crucial because we want to weigh the pros and cons.
On YouTube, we have many people listening to different experts. If the wrong information is given to the people, some can be hurt to follow the expert's information.
So the university's centenary, they decided that I should debate the chief, and the chief is Professor Rousseau, who was one of the key drivers of the 700 million Women's Health Initiative randomized controlled dietary modification trial, which ran from 1993 to 2005, but which I'll show the data continue to be analyzed up to 2019. So we're going to look at some of the papers coming out of this study right up to 2019. So now let's move on to the Women's Health Initiative study. And there's the study. And it starts with Allen's trial because the intervention group got additional interventions. And the subjects were initially followed for 8.1 years, and they've now been followed for a further 5 years thereafter. So the total follow-up is about 12 years now. And the first disappointment for Professor Rousseau and his team was that reducing total fat intake may have small effects on risk of breast cancer, no effect on risk of colorectal cancer, heart disease, or stroke. And so that's how that has been presented to the public, that there was no harm caused by the diet, but it didn't have much effect. Findings that should have been reported. But do remember that women with taking statins were at increased risk of developing diabetes. And the most important practical finding of this study was that only those postmenopausal women who are the healthiest, because they have neither coronary heart disease nor hypertension, can be reassured that eating the heart-healthy diet will not cause long-term cardiovascular harm and may be of some benefit. And I would argue that the postmenopausal women who are the healthiest are the ones who are not insulin resistant at the time the study trialed. So these were the absolutely healthiest people who were never going to get insulin resistance and diabetes and heart disease. And when they were on the diet, they did fine. Would they have done better on another diet? Maybe, maybe not. But it's the group who are insulin resistant with either hypertension or with coronary heart disease that do very badly on this diet. And we all know why that is. And it's absolutely to be expected. So in 2019, this is the most recent publication from the Women's Health Initiative. Yet the main finding of the $700 million study was that the diet harmed the health of women who began the trial in 1993 with coronary heart disease. All the rest is academic window dressing, perhaps at diverting attention from that extremely inconvenient finding. And that's how I read those papers. They're continually trying to justify why they didn't find what they should have found. In January this year, a study came out which really puts the whole thing in perspective, and that's called the Women's Health Study. And this was a study involving 39,000 apparently healthy US women who were aged at least 45 years in 1992, and they were randomized either to receive vitamin E or placebo, or aspirin or placebo, and they were followed for an average of 10 years. And the primary outcomes of this study were the first major cardiovascular events and total invasive cancer. And what they found was that vitamin E and placebo made no difference, really. There was no real evidence of benefit. But fortunately, they dissolved the study into a prospective study. So they followed these women and then they said, right, what of all these things that we measured could predict what the outcome would be? And the beauty was that they studied more than 50 risk factors, particularly for future coronary heart disease. So it's a fabulous study which came out of what was ultimately originally a negative finding. So the group was followed prospectively for a further 11.3 years to measure biological predictors of future risk for the development of coronary heart disease. And this is the paper that came out in January this year, the Association of Lipid, Inflammatory and Metabolic Biomarkers with age of onset for incident coronary heart disease in women. So what they're reporting is what were the risk factors that predicted the development of coronary heart disease. And this is the slide that is mind-blowing, because this finally puts it all in perspective. And what you see is that these are the hazard ratios, or the relative risk ratios, and you can see right out in front type 2 diabetes by a mile. Hazard ratio of 10,7, which is enormous. What's the second one? Metabolic syndrome. What's the third? Hypertension. What's the fourth? Obesity. And what are those all markers of? Insulin resistance, insulin resistance, insulin resistance. And when they looked at the blood biomarkers, there's a variable called the lipoprotein insulin resistance, and that was the single factor in the blood that predicted risk. Where did LDL cholesterol come in? Well, it's still running. It hasn't finished the race because it's so slow and so far behind. And you can see the hazard ratio is 1,38, which is meaningless. So what's really interesting is that the Rousseau hypothesis has been disproved by this study. His hypothesis, remember the debate we had, was that LDL cholesterol predicts heart disease risk? It doesn't. What was my hypothesis? Was that diabetes does? And unfortunately, for the Women's Health Initiative, that was what the finding was. So the Women's Health Study establishes that type 2 diabetes mellitus is the single most important risk factor for the development of future coronary heart disease. There it is. It closes the case. We don't need to discuss this any further. And the most important biochemical markers are those of insulin resistance, most especially the lipoprotein insulin resistance score. LDL cholesterol is of little predictive value. So what does that mean for the Women's Health Initiative study? Well, the Women's Health Initiative was a $700 million investment, the goal of which was to prove the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses. Instead, it proved that the low-fat, heart-healthy diet harms the health of those with pre-existing heart disease. Whereas the Women's Health Study shows that the best predictor of future coronary heart disease is type 2 diabetes, not the blood cholesterol concentration. So the most credible interpretation of the Women's Health Initiative is that the low-fat, heart-healthy diet promotes coronary heart disease in those with pre-existing coronary heart disease because they have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. And therefore, my conclusion is that according to the principle of first do no harm, it's no longer ethical to prescribe the low-fat, heart-healthy diet to those with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. That's what the study shows. And we know that there's so much other evidence corroborating this finding. But we now know that the most expensive diet study proved it's unethical to promote a low-fat diet for people with coronary heart disease. And the answer is, it tells us that you cannot prescribe a low-fat diet for women with coronary heart disease, and because that will cause harm. So it's unethical to do it. And I would argue that this is probably similar for men as well, that diabetes is the predictor of coronary heart disease. That's now established, and the reversal of type 2 diabetes is possible with a low carbohydrate diet. So therefore, we don't need any more diet heart studies to prove what we now know, that we want to prevent type 2 diabetes, and there's only one thing that really does that, and that's a low carbohydrate diet. So thank you very much for your patience and interest, and I look forward to interacting with you again sometime in the future.
Come on, one day a food is good, the next day is bad. These scientists can't agree on anything. Those studies that made the headlines around the world, people eating less saturated fat had as much cardiovascular disease as those eating more of it. Maybe saturated fat is not a factor, or maybe they're eating other bad stuff instead. How can we figure this out? We have to find out what else they eat, of course. That's exactly what Harvard researchers did. They found that people who eat less saturated fat and more unsaturated fat instead have lower cardiovascular risk. Those who eat more whole grains instead, things like oatmeal or brown rice, also had lower risk. But those who ate more refined grains instead, white bread, white pasta, sugary cereal, cookies, etc., their risk was the same, just as bad as saturated fat.
Here, Gill compares a sugar diet with high fat and makes a statement that they have the same problems. We don't know if the test was an RCT test and how it was performed.
This makes total sense. If you lump it all together, it's much harder to see a difference. especially because most people in our society eat way more of this than this. So, did that study make the cover of Time?
What conclusions can we make of this discussion? Maybe many experts just take the result of a study without a critical lens on the report. Peter and Paul can explain more about this phenomenon.
Yeah, remarkable lecture. It's got that knack of diving into the science and picking out what's right and what's wrong, basically. And the scary thing to me, Paul, is that we're seeing this time and time again now, that people are manipulating results. I always assumed, I was very naive, I guess. I assumed that whatever you read in some prestigious journals, you assumed was correct, because you assumed they went through a fairly rigorous review process and that wouldn't be published unless it was true. And yet, time and time again now, we see in these nutrition studies that the data is manipulated to suit the beliefs of the people doing the study, and it's pretty scary, really.
Well, and I think the most interesting thing is that this kind of misrepresentation of results can be done in such a way that even educated doctors and scientists are not able to detect it. And the reason is, I suppose they could detect it if they were thinking about it and if they were suspicious enough. But there's an element of trust in something that's published in a peer-reviewed journal that you expect, what you see is what you get. And the simple fact is, a lot of the way the data is presented is the conclusions that are drawn do not reflect the actual data.
Yeah, I've become a real sort of skeptic, I must admit. Everything I read now, I tend to be skeptical about, which is sad in a way, but at least it means I'm examining it. But for most people, and myself included, I don't have the scientific rigor and the experience to really pick out what's right and wrong. So we really rely on people like yourself and Tim Noakes and Zoe Harcum, who we'll be hearing from later in the weekend, who are very good at analysing these studies and picking out what the false data is, really, or the false conclusions anyway.
Well, I think the key points to take away from Tim's presentation too is, one, that the original Women's Health Initiative study actually found evidence of harms in a subset of postmenopausal females. A follow-up study actually found that those harms had apparently increased with time, consistent with dose dependency. And in the most recent publication of the Women's Health Initiative, the authors totally neglected to publish data on that subset of women altogether, which all seems to be a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, really scary stuff, and you'd love to try, hear them try and justify what they're doing, but obviously they're not going to. They just, bluster, as Tim discovered with his, debate. I mean, they'll just try and change the topic and not address the issues. They're very good at that. So it's really disappointing and very disillusioning as a scientist. That there are people out there trying to do that. But as we all know, there are very powerful forces that don't want anything to change, and both from a financial point of view, but also a reputational point of view. I mean, it's very difficult to do what Tim did, and that is to basically admit that he'd been wrong for 30 or 40 years, been giving the wrong advice. I mean, that's pretty. That requires a fair amount of courage, and someone like Tim has that sort of courage. But many others aren't prepared to do that because the reputational damage that would occur. I mean, to me, actually admitting you're wrong is a good thing. To come out and say, I've looked at the data, I've rethought the way I have new information. I admit that I was wrong, and to me, I think that that makes you look good in the eyes of science. I think, but obviously, to a lot of people, it's very threatening.
It's completely illogical that somebody like Tim would be criticised for changing his mind when his understanding of the science is what has driven that. I mean, to criticise people for actually evolving their views is basically to prevent any further advancement of medical science. It's completely and utterly illogical.
Yes, but it happens all the time. I mean, I guess people feel threatened and they react to that threat by by being aggressive, defensive, and they'll try and take on the people who are threatening their livelihood, reputation, whatever. And the science gets lost in all this. It's all about personalities and reputations and money and grants and so on. So, yeah, look, science has got a lot to sort itself out, I think, and I really believe that the review system in journal needs some sort of revision. I mean, people are not being rigorous enough in their reviews. I mean, these problems should have been picked up in the review of the journal by the reviewers or by the editors at least. But I think, basically, if you've got prestigious authors, people just let things go and publish it, whatever. They say, oh, these people have got a good track record, they must be okay. We'll publish it anyway without even examining the science of these papers.
It's that concept of eminence-based medicine winning out over actual evidence-based medicine.